the opportunity to have access and opportunity and to grow my own self and my family, then there shouldn't be barriers in my way because this is that goes against the concept of inclusion.
So I was thinking the other day about generations, and I'm thinking, like, okay, I'm 74, 54, 44. What
Mm-hmm.
happened during those times, which I'm probably including your father in this more than your grandfather, but what happened during those times? What did we miss in those generations that you still have to look forward for inclusion in our system?
Well, I don't know. I won't even say it was what was missed in the generation. Each generation has had a unique experience, and so the closer you, okay, that's how this is how I see it. The closer your generation is to like the impact of like, post Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the 20s, 30s, and 40s, right? Those were the people who were trying to that was a lot of hard work and a lot of putting yourself and your body and your family at risk of danger. And still, black folks still, rose to these, rose to still moving forward and being resilient and surviving because they were planning and they're looking beyond. So today's generation, I think, needs to continue that because I do feel like between maybe the 80s and 90s, there was this misconception that things are great and there's not a big, we're all like, everybody's the same, and there's this whole colorblind, false narrative that's been painted. So I think if there was anything that the older generation could have done was to keep on making sure that we as a people have a continue to build the strength that was already started to build. I don't know if I'm not sure if I explained that correctly, but that's how I see it.
Well, right now we have our special guest, Mr. Bodine Saunders, and he's wrote a book. He's an author now. He wrote a book called Race Against Race. And this book was actually written during the period that I believe that you're talking about. When did you leave Cheney, Mr. Saunders?
Uh, Mr. King, my freshman year at Cheney was January of 1984. Yeah, that dates me. Um, and I was there one semester. Cheney University, the oldest HBCU in the United States. And then I was lucky enough to get an opportunity to transfer and finish my athletic and academic career at Villanova, which is a Irish, Italian, Catholic university, very affluent. So my book is a memoir. It's about my experience. It's a binary narrative. Growing up in a black environment, attending the oldest HBCU in the country, and then transferring to an affluent. We used to call it back in the day a PWI. Nowadays, they use the term or acronym traditional white institution. So uh, that's my experience, and that's why I wrote about it.
Uh, my experience was kind of the opposite of yours because you said that you had never had a white coach during your during your sports career, and by me living in the neighborhood that I lived in, most of the time we got the throwaway teachers, so to suspect. They weren't good enough to teach in white schools, so they came over and taught us in the black schools. Uh, you know, uh, so our coach was the old white man that had his belt, hanging over, he had his belly hanging over his belt, throwing back a bunch of beers. To kind of date myself, my high school career, Joe Namath played it was his senior year in high school. So that tells you how old I am as far as sports. But you mentioned very specifically uh, the transition that you had to make from the way that you were taught by black coaches and the way that you were taught once you got to Villanova. Now, did this have to do with technique, or does this have to do with temperament?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, I fall on the sword and I write about it in the book that having the experience I did attending, I didn't start playing football until I was in the 8th grade, which was back then called middle school. And no, I'm sorry, junior high. Nowadays they call it middle school. So I already had a late start. I was a late bloomer. And so, but my experience relative to diversity was every coach I had, from the head coach to the position coaches, were all black men. And that was at every grade level: 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. And then boom, I get to Cheney, and all the coaches are black men. But then I get to Villanova, and it's a total different world. There's one black male coach on the staff, and all the rest of the coaches are white. And so I write about how I had to adjust coming from a Southern background, growing up in a Southern Baptist church, growing up in the South, growing up in a segregated community to a certain degree. So my Villanova was a new environment. So the best example I like to use is I had to learn to give my white coach the same level of respect I gave my black coaches. It wasn't his fault, meaning my white position coach. Defensive back is the position I played. It wasn't his fault or his issue that I had never been coached by a white coach. He had coached many black athletes in his coaching career. So once I was able to give him the same level of respect that I gave all my black coaches in my past, and I was helped to do that because of my immediate teammates, right? My defensive back brothers, who also had diversity in their background. They were playing Pop Warner football, Pee Wee football, so forth and so on. So basically, the more experience these guys had, and they had it abundantly more than I did, they were able to help me navigate that relationship with someone that I'd never had, the opportunity to be coached by. And once I was able to let go of the negative stereotypes that I grew up with hearing, again, hearing, not experiencing, right? Once I was able to let those chips fall off my shoulder and give him the same level of respect, he was able to coach me to be a better player. So it was my struggle. It wasn't his struggle. He was trying to pull greatness out of me. I was fighting it because I never had a white coach before. So that was my experience. So my experience, again, and that doesn't mean I didn't have any negative experiences, but I chose to write a book about the positive aspects of sports how sports brings people together across socioeconomic backgrounds, religions, and so forth, because I lived it. I saw it. I am a walking example of it, right? So I didn't write a book, a grievance book. I didn't point the finger. If anybody I pointed the finger at in my book, I pointed it at myself, because I wanted it to be an opportunity for people to learn from my mistakes and my experiences. And so I don't think you tend to learn when you point the finger all the time at someone else. Does that make sense, Mr. King?
That makes perfect sense. But one of the things that I found is when you're an athlete,
Mm-hmm.
you become a part of a select group. I mean, even in even in high school, you're called jocks. So I mean, for whatever that means, whether you're that big dummy lineman that's probably going to get a master's in mathematics. But I mean, but this is kind of how it works. You go within your circle and you establish within that circle, and you find out that even now, if you could probably find some of your Pop Warner teammates, you still have that camaraderie as athletes. You still, hey man, you remember when so and so caught that pass and went 99 yards, and then when he got to college he was a bust. Yeah, I mean, that's just how things go. So I think as former athletes, we have somewhat of a smaller circle to break through, because we already have some, whether they grow to be as influential as some of the people that you mentioned, like Charles Barkley, Dr. J, but there's a lot of other little people that you probably remember also,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
may have had an even greater impact in your life. So do you feel that as an athlete, black or white, that you had a natural advantage to advance further?
Oh, wow. That's a deep question. And I like that deep question, because I think, well, my purpose of writing my book also was to get people to critically think deeply. Yes, I mean, I highlighted enough people in my book so the readers could find and identify someone, because I firmly believe, because I try to be as truthful as I possibly can, it's very difficult to walk in someone else's shoes. Meaning, it's difficult for me to walk into one of my white brother's shoes and vice versa. So, why make it difficult for someone to walk in someone else's shoes that doesn't look like them, that didn't come from the same socioeconomic background and so forth? So I identified and highlighted a lot of people in my memoir so a reader could identify with Gene Fazio, Terry Sousa, Ed Collymore, Don DeCarlo, Bobby Lambert, right?
Yes.
So that way, it would be easier for the readers to say, okay, I don't understand exactly how Bodine felt or what his experience was, but I can identify with someone, and then that way they feel they've gotten something out of it at the end of the book, right? And then they can take that and then critically think about, okay, maybe I can do this now because now I get it, versus a lot of people bury their head in the sand, and hopefully I'm not going off on a tangent, but a lot of people bury their heads in the sand or stay away because they have anxiety regarding having conversations. But the camaraderie and the commonality, that's the word I'm looking for, the commonality that people can gain by identifying with someone helps building a relationship a little easier. And as you said, Mr. King, the experience of having camaraderie, having that chemistry, building experiences and memories is what keeps relationships and the fabric of those relationships tighter when things get tough, right? When you're having an uncomfortable conversation, which I don't believe you should have when you first meet someone. That's my opinion, my approach. I do eventually believe you will get to the uncomfortable conversations. But if you establish a relationship and you have a foundation, once you get to the uncomfortable relationships, then the chances are both parties are going to come out of that uncomfortable conversation still friends with a positive outcome and keep moving the ball forward versus two strangers, right, that do that. It's kind of difficult.
There's a couple instances in your book that I wanted to talk about. And the first, I might be pronouncing the name wrong, but
It's all right.
it was
Take a
your
shot at it.
a friend of yours named Veltre.
Veltra Dawson.
Veltre. Okay. And the incident that you two had with the police, and the way that there were two different trends of thought, because coming from Newark at that particular time, I was probably more like your friend Veltre. What the hell is going on? Why? Whereas you, being from the South, had a completely different idea of what was going on and how he should act.
Yes.
Can you kind of take me through that? Because I'm sure from the way that you wrote it in the book, this was kind of scary for you.
Well, you picked a good topic. My book memoir has 7 chapters, 42 topics. And each of those 42 topics is a insight into my experiences on 42 different topics. So one of the topics, I believe it's topic 28, is on the police.
Police
and my
race.
police race and my experience after the summer, during the summer, after the first national basketball championship our school won. Velter was on the basketball team. He was a freshman. I was a freshman on the football team. And so we were best buds. We established a great relationship with each other. He was from Highland Park, Illinois. I'm from Florida. We get our personalities mixed. I mean, the chemistry was there. And so after the championship during the summer, we get an opportunity to drive a rental car into Philadelphia because Villanova is out in the suburbs. And so Dwayne McClain, D-Train, got drafted to the Indiana Pacers. And you know how it is. Guy gets drafted. The agent and the team works out the contract. As soon as the contract is worked out, the agent gets on the phone, tells the player, hey, get on the plane, fly out here. Your contract is ready to sign right now. So he has a rental car. He leaves the keys with Veltra. He gets on a plane, flies to Indiana. He tells Veltra, here's the keys to the rental car. Please return the car Monday morning. Veltra says, great. He looks at me and says, Bo, we have a car for the weekend. So what do we do as young 19-year-olds? We take the car up and down the main line. We stop at every sports bar, every restaurant. The university just won the national basketball championship. We don't have to spend a dime of our money. People are buying drinks and food. We eventually work our way into Philadelphia, South Street. And so if anybody's familiar with, say, the Philadelphia Eagles or the 76ers, if they have a game on TV, just before a commercial, they'll show Jim Steaks on South Street, right? A crowd of people standing outside, and they show waiting to get their cheesesteak, and they'll show, right, the chef back there making the cheesesteaks. That's South Street. Very busy and popular street. we're cruising up and down South Street, right? Enjoying the scenery in a convertible rental car, two young brothers, good looking. I'll be nice. I'll pat myself on the back. Hey, that was 30 years ago. But all of a sudden, what happens? Police cars surround us, front, back, and on both sides. And it wasn't just 4 cars. It really seemed like 20, but it was probably more like 8 to 9 police cars literally surround us from every angle.
You're in Philly.
In Philly, guns drawn, they're screaming, hands up, and get out of the car. So we're getting 2 commands at the same time. One command is hands up. The other command is get out of the car. Okay, so what do? Veltra, being from a successful, above middle class Black family, had never experienced it before, ever. I had some experience dealing with the police in my past. Veltra had none. Veltra was driving. Veltra is not following the commands, meaning my mom had that talk with me. She says, when the police say something, you do it. Hands up on the dashboard or on the steering wheel. Don't talk back, right? Don't even make eye contact unless they absolutely ask you to, because if you make eye contact, you could piss somebody off because they think you might give them the side eye. I mean, the whole conversation I've had with my mom, right? Veltra didn't have that conversation with his parents. So Veltra is screaming, he's yelling at the police, why y'all stopping us? Yeah. And I'm sitting there looking at him going, shut your mouth. Come on, dude, you're going to get us killed, right? And so eventually we get out of the car, we go through the routine of putting our hands on the hood, and it was pretty heated. And all of a sudden, Veltra yelled, I played basketball for Villanova. And at that moment is when the temperature, you could feel it right there in the street. The temperature started to come down because it resonated with the police officers. Because if you think about it, when we won, meaning the school, won the championship, there was a parade down Broad Street. So the community, the tri-state area, was already still celebrating a basketball championship in the Philadelphia market. And so from that point on, I write about how most people reading the book would assume that we got stopped driving while Black, right? Because of all the experiences Blacks and people of color have had being stopped by the police. But what they will end up getting to, and I hate to, and I don't like using that word, I don't want to give it all away, but I will. The goal for that, and it's the entire goal of my memoir, is to get people to critically think. What you assume could be the answer and the issue may not necessarily be the issue. In other words, sometimes you have to wait it out and see what the full story is before you form an opinion about a issue, right? So what the reader will find out is, in the end, the police wasn't wrong with pulling us over because the rental car was reported stolen. We didn't do anything wrong because, as far as we were concerned, we were legitimately given the keys to the car to enjoy, right? The issue was, or the final issue that people will read is, back then, the rental car companies were a little different than they are today, right? And when Dwayne's agent rented the car for him, the only thing the rental car agencies asked the players or the agents to do is just to call in and say, hey, we're going to keep the car another week. That's it. You didn't have to show up, sign any paperwork, or just say, hey, I'm going to keep it one more week. We'll check in with you next week. Well, somebody forgot to make that phone call, and they reported the car stolen. So it wasn't anything we did. It wasn't, and the police were doing their job, legitimate. Checked the license plate, car reported stolen. They did their job. They pulled us over. But most people who start to read that particular topic will say, oh, I get it. They're pulling them over driving while black. Well, we know we've heard a lot of that, but that's not necessarily the case all the time. So I just wanted to put a little twist in there about police, because obviously we're going through this racial reckoning and social justice regarding police, and we need to have a broader conversation about police other than the traditional beat the police up, jump on the police. Again, there's plenty of negative reasons to voice our opinions about the police, but we also need to do a better job of telling all of the true stories about our interactions with the police. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, but I also have to take you back to the history of the police in Philadelphia. So, I mean, I'm not saying that, it was a driving while black situation necessarily, but do you feel that there would have been as many police cars if you had not been two black African Americans, right? Especially during the period that you're talking about, because as I recall, racial tensions in Philadelphia weren't that great either.
Oh, in the 80s? No, they were bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were pretty bad.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was when they started putting people in jail at the Philadelphia Eagles game. I'm not sure.
Oh, they had been doing that before I got.
Okay.
Yeah, they had been doing that before I got before I arrived in 1984. Yeah, they had been doing that before then.
Yeah. So,
but yeah, I mean, but it's a complicated issue, in talking about the police. My sister has worked she's a civilian police officer, and has been for a long time. But it's a complicated issue. If you talk about law enforcement in general, the FBI, they highly recruit retired athletes. Meaning, when I say retired, I mean retired from college. I consider myself a retired, right? A retired college athlete. The FBI recruits highly retired or former college athletes. A lot of companies recruit former athletes because they understand the team concept and so forth. So when you get that culture mixed in with other culture, the question is which culture is going to win, right? Or which one is going to stand out? Win's the wrong word. Which one is going to stand out? But listen, Mr. King, the race conversation, the race experience in America is very obviously very complicated. I was born in 1965. That's the year the Voting Rights Act was passed. The year before the Civil Rights Act was passed. So in other words, we're still as a country experiencing and evolving, right? For some people, we're not evolving fast enough, right? And for some people, we're evolving too fast for their take and for their liking. But as a country, we're really not that old of a country, right? 250 so odd years, right? In terms of, from our established charter. So we're still experimenting with our growth and development. We have a long way to go, true. but we've made some successes and have had some wins.
Well, yeah. See, part of that, what you said is my concern because I was born in 1947. So in 1965 and 67, when these voting rights or civil rights acts were passed, and supposedly the Jim Crow laws were abolished, I naively thought that we had overcame. Well, I'm still fighting the same fight. But let's go. Let's go on and talk a little bit more about your book, because there's another incident where, well, you wrote the book, so I guess it's no secret, where you were homeless,
Yes.
and you were talking about when you stayed in the room with the two brothers. I think one of them was a ladies' man that you mentioned, so you kind of didn't want to interfere with his activities. And you said that you thought that it was it was a natural order of blacks looking out for blacks. And then you moved to a room where you had two white teammates. And that was another learning experience, but we'll talk about that one a little later. The first one that I want to know, did you ever become disillusioned of that idea that blacks naturally help other blacks? Or did it finally come to reality that, maybe, it's not, just white people that, are not necessarily the ones that are trying to impede your movement forward, for lack of
That's
a better term?
Oh, no. That's a very good question. Hey, I grew up in the black community. I learned a long time ago that um, all of our skin folk are our kinfolk. So in other words, when you grow up as I did, in a black community, naturally you're going to have some chemistry problems with other people that look like you. Not everybody's going to get along. It's not a kumbaya or utopia experience, right?
Yeah, you
So
wrote about that too.
I am not naive, and I don't live in a dream world, a fantasy island, so to speak. I know my experiences. I've seen other people's experiences, but I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, right? And I grew up where my grandmother was one of the head ushers. We went to church, Sunday school and church every Sunday, like clockwork, right? I was lucky enough to get away with not going to Wednesday night church. But in other words, I had a solid spiritual foundation, right? And so I learned at an early age to treat people as you want to be treated, right? The golden rule: do unto others as if you have them do unto you. All of the good things, all of the positive things we learned in church. By the time I got to college, again, I was still, as I like to say, a slow learner, but a quick study. I understood that everybody wasn't going to get along. I understood that that even though there was a small number of minorities or people of color on campus, we all weren't going to get along just because we were a small group, right? But we tried to make the best of it. And there's a difference between your teammates and the normal student at the normal student class, meaning the black students that are there on academic scholarship, or they're there just to get, they're there for all obviously the same reason, get an education, but they're there for a different reason, so to speak, or they arrived on campus for a different reason, right? I arrived on campus because I identified as a football player, right? Not as a scholarship biology major or ROTC, Marines, or whatever. So everybody arrives on campus for their own reason and in their specific agenda. But I quickly learned that when you are in a smaller group, you tend to hold on a little longer with that group for as long as you can. Someone like literally has to really piss you off before you decide that you're going to kick them to the curb and not be their friend if they're Black, because it's so few of us that were on campus, right? And that was that experience. But it's so different when it comes to football, because football, even football, and the way I describe it in my book, football players have a different mentality than basketball players and track runners and soccer players, right? Football is a total different animal, right? And so we tend to be very aggressive, but we also tend to speak our truth. We don't beat around the bush. We're not passive aggressive, like I kind of say basketball players are. We tend to say what's on our mind because we don't have time to BS, right? We've got a job to do. You can get hurt doing that job. You can get hurt severely doing that job. And so football players tend to not beat around the bush. We say exactly what's on our mind. We get right direct and to the point. That way we can move on and get to whatever else we need to do.
And the other one that you talked about that kind of intrigued me were, I'm going to call it black girl options. I think you know what I'm referring to here when you were talking about interracial dating, and how you felt that if a black male took himself out of that particular dating pool, that it limited the options for the black women that were on campus. Uh, Usually, men, especially at that age, and I was that age one time, and I think half the women in the neighborhood had a dog whistle, but that's another story. But how did you come to that conclusion, being that macho type male, and that, you had to respect the feelings of the black women that were on campus too?
Well, I grew up with a bunch of women. My mom was the oldest of 5 sisters. I had 2 uncles on my mom's side. Uh, I grew up with 2 sisters in my home, but I had 2 other sisters. Really 4 other sisters. As I like to say, Papa was a Rolling Stone. But in my household, I had an older sister and an Irish twin, right? So, and then when you talk about my aunts, so I grew up in an environment where, the women were the leaders of the family, right? So by the time, and I didn't date in high school at all, right? There was no such thing as having a secret date or a secret crush on someone in church. Granny wasn't having that. So anyway, but I was focused on football. So I didn't have a girlfriend until I got to college. And at Cheney, that experience was different than the dating experience at Villanova. Obviously, Cheney was the oldest HBCU in the country. Villanova was less than 3% minority walking on campus. So I knew from my experience at Cheney that the experience our sisters were having at Villanova was tougher because they didn't have, the ratio wasn't there. The numbers weren't there. So it became very difficult for, in terms of their options. Because if you think about it, I mean, I knew this graduating high school. There were more women in college than there were men. So if there were more women on college campuses than there were men, that meant the ratio were not in their favor in terms of dating. And if they specifically wanted to date, if an African American woman wanted to specifically date a black guy, date within her race, it was going to be tough because the numbers weren't there. So
Yeah,
I kind of felt for them. It was difficult.
but for you as a football player, the numbers were overwhelming.
Yeah, but I had a girlfriend, so it didn't matter. I mean, I was, you know, I was lucky enough to date Mr. Irving. I rarely call him Dr. J. I was lucky enough to meet Dr. J's wife at the time, Turquoise Irving. I was lucky enough to meet her assistant. So I was lucky. I got introduced to a black girl within 2 or 3 weeks of being on campus. And so we slowly started to build a relationship. I mean, we didn't just immediately started dating. It took a while, but it took a while because I was focused on football. It was not my focus. I was so consumed, Mr. King, with wanting to prove I could play Division I football that all of the distractions, all of the noise, I pushed aside. So
Now,
a lot of the things that normal college students deal with and go through, I didn't pay it no mind, if that makes sense.
being a former soldier, and you know, believe me, I know exactly what you're talking about.
I'd like to hear your other guest. You know, she's been gracious to be hanging in here. I'd like to hear her opinion on some of the things we've talked about.
Let me see if I can get Dahlia in here. Dahlia, are you there? She was muted a moment ago. Dahlia, can you hear us? She's actually at an athletic event with her son.
Oh, okay.
And she said she's listening in. She was on. She kept us with a little conversation until we got you on. So,
well, the next time she chimes in, ask her to chime in because I strongly believe that, you know, having an open conversation is good for everybody. But I will follow up with what we were talking about with how I went from my black teammates having my back when I was homeless and I was only homeless for about a week, maybe 2 weeks. But what happened was I didn't have enough money to pay for room and board. I had enough to pay for tuition. And so my black teammates would say, hey, you can bunk with me for 2 or 3 nights until you figure it out. And then another set of black teammates would say, oh, yeah, you can stay with me until you figure it out. And then another set of black teammates said, you can stay with me until you figure it out. So next thing you know, 6-7 days go by and I'm in the room with Jeff Dingle, Xavier Hargrove, and rest in peace, Jeff Dingle, who died in 9/11. He was a great guy, one of the smart. I write about him in the book. He was one of the smartest brothers I ever met in my life. He and Rasheed Walker and Bobby Days. So I was sleeping on the floor, or what we call it, couch crashing, right? Couch crashing on this guy's couch, crashing on that guy's couch. So I'm in Jeff Dingle's and X-Man room. That was Xavier's nickname, X-Man. And next door was Rich Lage and Perry Hodge. And Rich Lage dad passed away during the summer, just before fall practice started. But word didn't get out until we arrived on campus for preseason practice. And because of preseason practice and how busy it was, I never really got a chance to express my sympathy to Rich Lage. And so I just took the opportunity to literally walk next door, knock on the door, stick my head in the door, and I was going to speak my piece and say, sorry to hear about your dad, boom, boom, boom. And in the room was Rich Lage and his freshman roommate, Perry Hodge. And before I could open my mouth, Rich Lage says, hey, I noticed you're sleeping on the floor next door. You all right? I'm like, yeah, I'm all right. You know, I got some issues with getting a room. I'll work it out. And before I could say anything else, he says, no, why don't you stay with us for the whole year? And then the freshman, his freshman roommate, Perry Hodge says, and Perry was a backup quarterback and starting punter. Now, the courage of freshmen would take the opportunity to say, hey, why don't you stay with us a whole year? Come on. It took courage for that freshman to do that, right? And so they literally allowed me to stay in their room my entire junior year, and Rich Lage was a junior as well. They were gracious, empathetic, and we learned a lot. And we learned so much that more than half of my book is about my experience, right? Well, not more than half of my book. About a third of my book is about our time together as roommates and what we learned about each other, right? How I was able to learn about and debunk stereotypes, how we all was able to debunk stereotypes because we were now roommates, right? Those negative stereotypes that I heard about white folks and the negative stereotypes that they heard about black folks, right? We were able to work those out because we were now living in the same room.
Well, see, being a paratrooper, I mean, I liken it to the team concept because the whole is greater than the individual, which is something that you learn in football. A lot of team sports try to teach you, but I think it's more cohesive within football teams, especially. Do you find it on the subject of inclusion? Do you find it easier to accept or to think that because we're within an elite group, we are more bound to accept inclusion rather than the average person on the street?
Yes. And I generally like to say this when I'm having conversations with folks. I was not in the military. My dad was, my brother was. I'm sure I could think of other folks in my family or friends who were. Villanova has a large ROTC and Marine and Navy presence on campus. So having said that, the military is a better example than sports, right? But I wasn't in the military, so I don't like to use analogies and cliches and metaphors regarding the military because I wasn't one. I just know I'm pretty sure if I was in the military, I was in combat and I was in a foxhole it wouldn't make one iota of difference who was on either side of me if our goal was to stay alive, get the job done, and get back home to our families, right? So to me, the military is the top example of diversity and inclusion, and they've worked their way through that over the years, just like sports has worked its way through the years, had evolved over the years, because sports excluded people of color in its beginning, right? So we've grown and matured and evolved over the years. Right now, sports is a perfect, for me in my explanation, a perfect example of diversity and inclusion. It's a meritocracy, right? If you're the best at that position, you're going to play. If you're second best, you're backup. If you're the best quarterback and you happen to be black, you're going to be the starter. It wasn't always, but now we're at that point, right? Where if you're the best quarterback and you happen to be black, doesn't matter. You're the starter, right? We're not that far removed from where a black athlete who played college quarterback was asked to move to a different position. I'm sure that question may happen every now and then, but a top level quarterback at a D1 school who's, in the top 10 is not going to be asked to move. It probably is a guy on at a lower level that might get asked to move. But if you're talking about a guy that comes out of the SEC, ACC, or, the big 5 power conferences, the chances are a black quarterback is not going to be asked to move to wide receiver if he's that good, right? So we've evolved to a point where race has nothing to do with the position. If you look at the perfect example of the white running back for the Carolina Panthers, absolutely. His dad was a Broncos receiver. His mom was a great college athlete.
Christian McCaffrey.
Hey, listen, the guy's a running back.
It's on my fantasy team.
Period. No ifs, ands, and buts about it. He's a running back, right?
He's a running back.
and it's unfortunate that there aren't as many white running backs, right? And that's another conversation of why that is. But I like the fact that he was able to overcome the noise, the distractions, because it was out there. It may not have been said publicly or in the media, but people can be nasty, in their own little space.
But now you are also old enough to remember when Jefferson Street Joe won the Super Bowl, and we thought things were going to change then. Now I will admit, like you say, if you're the best quarterback, I mean, we got Cam Newton, we got Lamar Jackson, we got Patrick Mahomes. I mean, you go through the top 10 teams, you probably have at least 3, if not 4 black quarterbacks that are leading them. So I understand the transition, but it's that time period that you keep talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, is this going to happen in my lifetime? Is it going to happen in my grandkids' lifetime? Right now, I'm not concerned with the rest of my life as I am by the generations after me.
What? And I'm sorry, I probably lost my train of thought. What are you concerned about? Is what going to happen?
Inclusion and when we talk about the want and the need of the average person to embrace this.
And, I got you.
In other words, for people of my generation, what is the difference between inclusion and integration?
Right. Your generation is different than my generation, and I'm a Generation X, right? You're probably a boomer. Um, and my daughter's
Millennial,
Z.
maybe?
No,
Z? Okay.
she's a Z. She's a Z,
Okay.
right? She's a Z, and it's different for them, right?
Right, right.
So the goal is
Social media has made a big difference for them more than
listen,
for our ages.
absolutely. So the bottom line is, I try to keep it simple. I try to stay in my lane and use what I have experienced and know to be a fact. The bottom line is that um, we have made progress. Sports is a perfect example of how we've made progress. It would be a great, it is a great example for others to um, follow, research, understand how we as the sports community have been able to bridge that gap regarding diversity and inclusion. There's a foundation of sports, just like there's a spiritual foundation, right? That I grew up with. I wasn't perfect at it, but I grew up with it. And then also, I had a combination of the foundation of sports, meaning discipline, teammates, right? Listening, communication, protect each other, police each other, trust each
Leadership.
other, leadership, all those things coaches, especially good coaches, teach their players, right? So I had a foundation of sports and a spiritual foundation I was able to lean on, fall back on, that helped me, and a lot of athletes do as well. Again, we're not perfect, but it's a good example. So there are, the general public, instead of pushing back or fighting the perfect examples, or the good examples, I'm sorry, the good examples that sports has and has created. Instead of pushing back on that, they should accept it and embrace it. I mean, the bottom line is there's a lot of parents out there who put their kids in organized sports because they also understand it's a great way for their kids to build relationships across socioeconomic backgrounds, race, and religion. They do it all the time. They know that's where else are they going to get it if they don't put them in a sport that allows them to do that, right? So to answer your question, yes, the general public is far behind, but if they allow themselves the opportunity to embrace the example that athletes, right, show and do, I think we could accomplish more.
Well, here's the thing that I'm kind of perplexed with. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, when we had the first incident of Black Lives Matter, uh,
Mm-hmm.
there were a couple stations that told athletes to shut up and dribble. That was their job. Their job was to play sports.
Oh yeah.
Then a good friend of yours that you mentioned in the book, uh, Charles Barkley, he came out and made a statement about, I wouldn't necessarily say inclusion, but about the way that people are being treated.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave his professional opinion. Then we had LeBron and some others make statements concerning Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also still have um, a lot of financial malfeasance within almost every organization that we deem to hang our hat on, whether it be the NAACP, whether it be various religious organizations. Um, and the thing that how do you build this circle of inclusion, which has to be built on trust? But on the other hand, you have to see if look and see if someone's hand is in your pocket.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's again, Mr. King. That's a deep one. Let me take it back. Let me take it back to the beginning.
I
And
try to
you,
I try to be a guy that doesn't give you a lot of softballs.
I mean, again, you that question is a great question because you've now advanced the football so far that you're bypassing some of the process, the beginning process. So we've got to start at the beginning process, right? You use CB, we call him CB1, because there was another classmate of mine named Connolly Brown, and we called him CB. So when Charles started hanging out with us, we would say CB1 and then Charles Barkley, and CB2 was Connolly Brown. But when CB started hanging out with us and we started hanging out with him, I quickly understood and learned how he was able to navigate being he was already, basically he was everything coming out of Auburn. He cemented and planted and staked his position on the Sixers as a rookie, right? Imagine you're a rookie and you're in the locker room with Moses Malone, Bobby Jones, Julius Erving, Maurice Cheeks. I mean, come on. But so he staked his position and he was there to stay. So, but he was also a young man growing, right? And so, and the reason why I kind of felt like I was connected with Charles is because my family was from Alabama and his family was from Alabama. My family was from Mobile and Atmo. His family was from Leeds. Even though I grew up in Jacksonville, my mom's side of the family was, hardcore Alabama. And so we were able to generate a chemistry with each other. And believe me, I was not an all-star. I was not a superstar. Okay, I was not. But people knew I was determined to prove that I was a football player at the Villanova 1AA level. Athletes on a pro level have privilege to, everybody, again, we could go all day. Everybody at some point in time, based on the space they're in, has privilege, right? Okay, we talk about white privilege. Well, guess what? There's biology privilege. If you're hyper intelligent and you're a biology major and you're going to be a scientist, at some point you're going to have privilege. If you are an English major, you're going to be a writer. There's privilege. If you're a basketball player, football player, or you're in the band, marching band, depending on where you are in the marching band and at what school, you may have privilege, right? There's different levels of privilege, right? But to continue with that, yes, athletes have privilege to a degree where it can be beneficial regardless if you're black or white, right? So it's how you use that privilege, right? I talked about it early on. After the school and the basketball team won the championship, Veltra and I got into a rental car, drove up and down the street, and then eventually made our way into Philadelphia and didn't have to spend a dime. Everywhere we walked into, someone bought us drinks. That's privilege. That's also, right, enjoying privilege. So, athletes have privilege and they have the ability to affect change. They have the ability to um, bring attention to a topic or an issue. And it's different than your generation, right? Because TV's different. In your Mr. King, in your generation, there was 3 channels, maybe 4. When I graduated high school, that was the beginning of cable. 1979 to 1983 is the beginning of cable, right? And that means more channels, more content. That means more money. That's when money started flowing into sports, right? Because more channels, more content, more advertising dollars. We're going through that same wave now. You got podcasts, you got streaming services, all of that, right? More channels, you got to fill those channels with content, right? So things are different. So my generation Z, because I'm X, she's growing up in a different world than I was growing up in when I was 21 years old. And my world is different than your world when you were 21 years old. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I have heard, as a great grandfather, is that our generation, meaning mine,
Mm-hmm.
we were so content to make sure that we kept your generation safe,
Mm-hmm.
and that you would not have to go through the same struggles that we went through. Was that all kind of a fallacy? Because you're having to go through the same thing, and if you had a son, you would have to have the conversation that you were talking about, that your grandmother, or that
My
that they
mom
had,
had with me, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So you talk about time. How much time do we have? Or I mean, it is. Can we keep an open-ended timetable? This at some time, at some point, does there have to be a concrete change?
I think Mother Nature forces us to change. And I say Mother Nature because I know there are people out there that are agnostic. There are people out there that may not strongly have a stronger belief, spiritual belief than others. So I just, I'll just use for example, I write about, and I use Mother Nature in my book. Because people know when you say Mother Nature, they understand you're talking about a higher being, right? The bottom line is Mother Nature is going to make it where we're going to have to make a decision as human beings, whether or not we're going to come together or not. And what do I mean by that? You look at the climate change, hurricanes, earthquakes, fires, all that stuff. Those things are real. Those aren't imaginary. Those aren't conspiracy theories, right? My daughter's, out west, and every time there's a huge fire, I'm paying attention. Every time I hear about a potential earthquake, I'm paying attention. I have family in the South. Every time it's hurricane season coming around, right? Those things, are in my face. So when you talk about climate change and drought, the things that are happening in other continents around the globe, something's gonna happen. This is people are gonna say now you're reaching into theory, but I've seen that movie before, right? Something's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen, but something's going to happen. I may not be alive when that happens. It could be 40 years from now or 140 years from now. But something's going to happen because that's always the way it works. If you think about a team, right? The movie Remember the Titans with Denzel Washington, right? In order for those guys to come together and respect each other and get on the same page to focus on winning, they had to have barriers and difficulties and hardships. Once they were able to overcome those, and it woke them up and realized that they were all equal, right? Everybody else outside was a distraction. It was all about them as a family. Once they realized that, they were able to go on and accomplish their dreams. So in other words, sometimes you got to get into a car accident to wake the hell up and realize that what we've been doing isn't working or is not working well. And who else can wake us up more so than Mother Nature? Mother Nature can wake you up, right? So it's going to take some catastrophic event. The pandemic is a perfect example. A lot of people are now evaluating their lives differently because of the pandemic, right? They're evaluating whether or not the job they were working is worth it, or do they want to switch careers, right? Or they're evaluating whether or not that their boss is a good boss, and do they want to give all of their energy to that boss and that company. So the pandemic is a small, and I don't want to belittle the pandemic, but it's a small example of how Mother Nature can cause people to wake up and go, okay, what we're doing isn't working regarding human relationships. How can we get better at it?
I definitely understand what you're talking about, because I'm also a sports writer, so I have to be concerned with air travel and the crowd after you're in the arena, and you know especially at my age, being susceptible to But
Mm-hmm.
I did enjoy our conversation, but we have to continue it. So I'm going to ask you to come back at some time in your. We have another 4 weeks that we're going to be talking about inclusion, and maybe you'd. I'm going to have a panel or roundtable discussion, uh, and maybe you can come back either on the 21st or the 5th of July, and we can talk. Have a roundtable discussion with some other guests.
Well, I just wrote the 25th of June and the 5th of July. 21st.
Okay.
I'm sorry, 21st of June.
Right.
So yeah, let's exchange emails about that, and let's see if we can make that work. I'd love to come back.
All right. Well, for right now, why don't you give us your final thoughts? Give us a plug for the book, and we enjoyed having you.
Oh, Mr. King, I appreciate you inviting me. For anyone that any of your viewers and your fans and your audience, if they're interested in reading my book, you can go to my website, bo-deansanders.com, and all the information's there. My book is available now through any of your favorite online retailers. Obviously, you'll get it faster through Amazon. And in terms of what people will get out of reading my book, there are a lot of great reviews on Amazon. So if you really want to take someone else's word versus mine, read the reviews. I've got some 5-star reviews, global reviews too. The bottom line is that we have it within ourselves to advance the conversation about race and advance our position regarding race, right? And it just takes one step and then follow the process, right? For those who don't know how or have anxiety about starting a relationship or a conversation around race, um, I understand it's not that difficult. Don't try to bite off more than you can chew. It's just like meeting somebody for the first time. You shake hands, introduce yourself, you find common ground, and then you continue the conversation about what you find that you have in common. Don't find common ground and then turn around and decide you want to move the conversation to race. No, you haven't built a relationship long enough, right? If you meet someone for the first time from an opposite race, and that's for a black person as well as a white person, right? You should not be having a beginning conversation about Black Lives Matter. No, that's too difficult of a topic, too polarizing of a topic to have if you're meeting someone for the first time and your goal is to establish a relationship. If your goal is just to debate the issue of Black Lives Matter, then go ahead and do that. But if your goal is to build relationships, then the goal is to introduce yourself and begin building a relationship that way, as you would normally do it with meeting someone for the first time, right? You meet somebody at a restaurant or a dinner party, you shake hands, you exchange names, you begin a conversation, you find what you have in common, and then you focus on what you have in common and build on that. You don't divert the conversation to a very polarizing topic. No. So it's just that simple. And then you go from there. So I'll leave with that.
All right, Mr. Sanders, I will definitely be in touch, and I enjoyed talking with you. You have a great evening.
I appreciate it, Mr. King. I look forward to hooking up with you again. Take
All
care.
right, sir.
Ciao.
That was Mr. Bodine Sanders, our author and guest. I'm right now turning our show over to the San Diego Black Panther Party and Brother Robert Ward Williams. Brother Williams, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing fine, Brother James.
Uh, After talking with a couple people with concerning our subject of inclusion, um, is inclusion a fantasy?
Well, I personally like to think not that it's a fantasy, but what I would like to say is that there's a lot of work that has to be done. And what we can't do is think that we can exist inside of a bubble and make things right in one locale and it not be something that has to be addressed on a global scale. And I think there lies the problem because what we find is, to me, I like to even go back to the concept I talk about from time to time called epigenetics. And this just goes back to the fact that things have been the way they have been for so long that they have been ingrained in us, in the way we think, the way we perceive the world, and from a systemic and systematic perspective, just worldwide view. um, we play the role of the victim, and they play the role of the victimizer to such a degree of subconsciousness that as we attempt to even address this, on a personal basis and a personal perspective, we find ourselves inundated with so much work that has to be done. Now, again, I myself is optimistic, so I still am up to the challenge, but I kind of think it picks up where your last guest left off in, like when you are dealing with personal one-on-one relationships and just relationships in general. How do you go about approaching a subject matter toward building equality with a people that automatically, or a person, just a one-on-one relationship, a person would automatically become defensive first, um, and that takeaway from that defensive posture will a lot of times create a stigmatism that prevents you from even revisiting that same concept later on. So you, in essence, have to find yourself, winning someone over just in terms of your personality and attempting to judge you based on, the character they find in you before you even try to adjust anything from a political standpoint or just a social construct standpoint. And then in doing so, now all of a sudden it may even create a dilemma of obligation to hear you out. So there's, so much work that has to be done, just to try to get to a perspective to where we can bring this up, which I think goes right into the idea, I think that is in essence behind just having a reparations bill to study reparations. That pulls the topic and discussion on the table, that pulls critical race theory on the table, and that creates that blanket environment that we need to just even talk about this, despite police brutality, despite obvious incidents of racism that we face. But we have to have somewhat of a shield or somewhat of a avenue to even put this on the table, because we've been dealing with it for so long, and it's been so ingrained in the way of life of not just America but just across the world in terms of how they view color and race, to where it is daunting.
Now, this is something that I've been really cautious about approaching. But it does seem to me that any organization that hooks its wagon to black freedom, black evolution, whatever you want to call it, always seem to, how should I put this? Where at one time they were a part of the wagon, now all of a sudden they're drivers in the wagon, and we're still the passengers. How do we keep letting this happen? Or am I looking through, just pessimist lenses here? Maybe I'm just looking at this from an old folks perspective. Eh, can you kind of enlighten me here? Like, what the hell is going on?
Well, I think you're looking at it the way it really is, and fortunately, what that has to do with, as far as you being able to say that, and James, let me say, you being able to get away with saying that, has to do with the fact that you've been around and you witnessed through just experience and just through historical recognition that seems to be the pattern. But I like to go back to one of the things that I point out often, across a lot of podcasts that I go on, is that what we have as a people have to recognize is that we are at war. And in saying that, I like to start off with that, because knowing that we're in a predicament that demands that we maintain a level of strategy, of conduction, and of tactile operation, because you are at war, there will be casualties. And unfortunately, within a war and within a system approach in dealing with casualties, if we do not identify with the fact that that is the approach that we have to take this from, then when we make a certain level of headway, or when we try to start becoming inclusive, then typically what happens is people utilize just the spirit of our movement, and it becomes something else other than our movement, and our movement becomes a springboard for someone else's operation. And I think that just has to do with the inherent nature of capitalizing. Remember, we live in a system that's based on capitalism. Too often people associate capitalism with just economics. They don't recognize that capitalism is a mind state. Capitalism has to do with seizing the time, that even the Panthers would say back in the day, taking advantage of a situation and using that to further along your situation. And unfortunately, as Africans and as Black people, because we identify with the greatest level of atrocities other than any other group, that spirit of that pain is often I would say brought down to the level of other types of situations. And without, and let me say this without being offensive. For instance, I would say sexuality comes into that play, and quite often the pain that we feel as African people tends to get equated with someone else's some other type of pain, and lo and behold, another type of movement identifies with that pain and uses that as their springboard. And because someone else is identifying with a level of pain, oftentimes that is cloaked in our message to appear as though someone else actually can identify with what we're going through, simply because the one condition that we both share is pain. But it is a totally different concept as to dealing with the oppression, racism, and self-destruction and destruction that takes place with us because of our skin color and our heritage and our culture. Then it does have to do with someone who, for whatever reason, decides that they can't express themselves this way or that way. And the key element here is pain. So when you recognize that you're on a battlefield, you recognize that you're at war, then you realize, or you look upon those type of intrusions as spies. And if you approach it from the standpoint of spies, you approach it from the standpoint of knowing that the enemy will attempt to overtake your situation and exploit that situation and make it their own, and in doing so channel the operation to be something other than what it was intended to be. So when you approach everything that you operate from as being on a battlefield, then you think about, well, what about this? Well, what about that? Or how do we view our success rate, just say 10 years from now, 20 years from now? You have to throw social engineering into the fold, because if we don't look at things, from by addressing historical trends and looking at it by through the eyes of projection, it will be real easy for us to find ourselves in the back seat, no longer even driving the vehicle of fighting for oppression that we intentionally set out to do, simply because we want to be inclusive and allowing others to take part in this. And that inclusion only makes sense because from a world perspective, as it applies to humanity, period, we have to, as a human race, come together. But again, there are far few people who have the righteous intent of actually addressing the real problem that we're talking about now, versus using that as a springboard or a borrowed energy pattern, as we would say in martial science, to spearhead their movement and derail our movement in the process.
So, is that a lack of leadership or a lack of uh, stability within the institutions that we normally turn to?
I think it's a combination, and see, it's both, and more so. The thing is, let me just look at this through the eyes of project management, which is what I deal with on a day-to-day basis. When you go into addressing a project, and when you want to deliver, have a deliverable at the end of your project, the point is you have to be able to visualize where it is you want to be in the end. So in essence, if I set out to build a building, to build a structure, to build an institution that fights racism, then I have to first and foremost start with what does it look like at the end of this project. And I have to see what those components are that made up that end result. And along the way, as I'm at the drawing board now, I'm not even in the field yet. I'm at the drawing board. I have to account for different types of things that could possibly go wrong with the project. I have to be able to look at the project from the standpoint of a threshold of failures. And then I have to actually come up with processes that would along the way address these potential failures. And then I have to have something within my project that gives me a cushion to deal with those type of failures that I didn't foresee. And along the way of doing all of this, I have to be able to have my entire team be on board with my vision so that the processes that are put in place to accomplish the end goal, everybody knows their specific roles to the T. And not only that, that there is room and growth so that all of this can be passed on to the next working shift. And I think that's where we tend to drop the ball, is when we tend to clock out and the next shift goes to start and they did not get proper instruction of where we left off in our project, to put it in broad sense. And within the Panther Party, we refer to that as going into general orders when we talk about, basically providing the detail and the information on to those that are taking over from your duty station. And the same thing goes into everything that we should approach, is that we need to be recognizing that we have to, like you said, is it a problem with leadership? When I say yes, it is a problem with leadership. It has to do with the fact that we have to be leaders and build leaders at the same time. You can't just be out front and ripping and running or supposedly working your vision, and you're not able to also reconstruct that same vision to the next generation, or and pass and have the ability to pass that along to the next generation. And so, again, being on the battlefield, knowing this in lies where the enemy will continually strike at your forces to dwindle your forces, to try their best to prevent you from having the optimum situation to pass along those elements of instruction that you've learned from and where you left off. So I would say that one of our biggest issues is that when we think leadership, we do not think leadership in terms of building and propping people up, the next generation up in place to be able to carry out the implementation of empowerment. See, when we think Black leadership, what we think about is going to somebody for all of the answers and letting them do all of the speaking, all of the work, and we'll just get behind them. See, when it comes to addressing oppression on a long-term level, and it comes to addressing, I would just say, building a structure, building up something that's going to have a lasting result, then you have to have all of these things accounted for. So that next generation has to be put in a position to where it has all of the tools, all of the resources that you've had, and then some. It's no different than how, as parents, our goal is for our children to get a better education than we had, to be able to go further in life than what we had. So why do we not think that same way when we are processing and working toward empowering our community? To me, it's just it has to be that approach. And in saying that, that kind of goes back to the first thing you asked me about, which creates that daunting uh, situation to where it is a lot of work to be done. But the sooner we accept that role, and the sooner we hold ourselves accountable to that, those that are of us that are in it, and recognize that in teaching and moving forward and addressing the things that we are addressing, we have to be making sure that we have the next generation right there with us, and feeding off of that information and feeding off of the wealth of knowledge or experience that we've had, and so that they don't have to encounter the same set of circumstances, as well as so that they're equipped with the new variant form of circumstances. It's like dealing with a virus. You know, you may have a strand or an antidote that addresses one thing, but you still have a team that's constantly working toward the next level of the game. And so we have to look at things in that standpoint. So as leaders, we have to be leaders of leaders, so to speak. And that's my
Well,
answer to that one.
well, now you mentioned a war, and this is something that I can relate to. But when I'm on the ground waiting to load up into the chopper, and I see them unloading all this wounded off of the chopper, and I see them washing blood out of the floorboard of the chopper. I have to get on this chopper and go into that battle. So how do you, as a leader, give me the morale to go into what might be my certain death? Figuratively or literally speaking, when you're talking about a war here.
That's a good one. And let me go into certain aspects of Panther ideology just to address that. Because what you bring up now is actually the militancy aspect of how we operate. And see, a lot of people get that twisted and they think that when they think Black Panther Party and they think the militant stance, they think that it has to do with carrying weapons or just trying to posture. In essence, what it has to do with is really borrowing from the same thing that happens within a military, and that's fortifying your mind and preparing you for warfare, the realization of war. So, in other words, when in the military you went through a boot camp, that boot camp was meant to rigorously get you prepared to be able to go out on that battlefield and see the high levels of casualties and see the possibility that you may not make it, but at the same time strengthen you mentally to be able to still give your all, as well as ingrain in you the concept of being a patriot, the concept of this, you're going to war for something that is bigger than you. So now if you apply that same concept to us fighting the fight of dealing with oppression, then what we're saying is that when people get involved in this, the position that they should have is that they're fighting a fight, fighting a war that is bigger than them as an individual. So then the patriotism comes into place with the fact that when I go involve myself in this movement, I see that it's bigger than me. And by seeing that it's bigger than me, I am not concerned with the fact that I may be a casualty of that war because I see the fact that my sacrifice is for the greater good of the end result. And so the mentality of preparing a soldier for war has to be part of that leadership training that we're talking about. And again, I'm glad you brought it up the way you did because a lot of us don't see it that way. So if in fact my personnel jump on that chopper and are afraid to go into battle, then in essence, I may not have done my part. And that's not to say that everybody is going to be able and be prepared for that battle. But the bottom line truth of the situation is that we are all at war, whether we want to admit it or not. And that is the eye-opening piece of this equation that has to come into play, is that we don't recognize that, but yet we are still being faced with the onslaught of being a casualty. And I would like to say that by just giving a little paraphrase of someone talking about the justice system in general. You will go in and say the system is not broken, it's just the accuracy threshold as it applies to casualties does not factor in Africans. So we find ourselves at the blunt end of a suppressed statistic. So with that, the thing is again, we are at war. We just don't want to, a lot of us just don't want to admit it. A lot of us just feel like that basically what we can possibly do, even as we do admit it, is we can just duck down in the bush and wait for all of the shooting to be over and pop up at the end of the war and get away, or just hide in the jungle and just live our best life and just seclude ourselves in a bubble away from everything that's going on around us. But again, what does that do for future generations? All that's going to do is that may aid and allow you to be able to run, from a circumstance right as it applies right now. But you cannot hide the next generation. In as people, as humans, we can't hide from the inedible, uh what goes on down the road. We cannot hide from the future. And so this basically requires that we be critical of ourselves, be critical of the recognition that we have to find a way to make this work. We have to find a way to build on something that can be again passed on to the next generation, and that each generation that is involved in this has to recognize their role, their part, and do it. That's my answer to that.
Uh, are we playing catch up with our generations here? I mean, because it seems like we've played hopscotch.
I do feel that we are playing catch up, and I would say that simply because even when I look at our 10-point platform within the Panther Party, the deal is what was handed down to my generation was a platform that was actually outdated, and they didn't recognize that it was outdated. So from that standpoint, we even had to go back to the drawing board and revise that so that we can approach the battlefield with a more up to date process that would allow us to be able to go into the fight and do a better job. And so, yes, we are playing catch up. Unfortunately, again, it's recognizing the weaknesses and knowing that even though I may be caught in a position to where I don't like it, I may be behind the curve, and again, the like if we're running a race, the gun was already fired and they've already made a lap ahead of me. But guess what? Do I just stop and just decide not to run, or do I go ahead and give it my all and do my part? You can't look at it from that perspective. We got to look at it from the perspective that we must do our part. And then in addressing, like I say all the time, addressing oppression, we have to get to the point to where we're able to outpace the pace of oppression. And you can't do that if you're running at a pace uh, further behind the just general pace of what's going on. That's no different than someone getting a raise, but that raise won't equate with the natural course of the cost of living. And so, from a mental standpoint, we're finding ourselves battling with the fact that our gains are below the cost of living gains as it applies to moving forward in this. So then what we have to do is we have to come up with a better approach. That better approach means that we need to find ways to magnify our efforts. And we can't go tit for tat, but we need to find ways to actually be able to take the few and maximize upon that and do the job, and have a single person be able to do the job of 10, and then that be incorporated within our leadership training styles, so that those people that are below me in terms of the generation or the youth are able to increase that fold, and so on and so forth. And at the whole time in the process in doing so, this goes into what we call define, develop, and then defend. We have to be able to defend everything that we defined and developed, so that, going back to what you stated earlier, we're not allowing someone else to jump on the bandwagon and steer the wheel and push us in the back seat. So that is kind of the approach that has to be dealt with. So it's going to take some of the brightest minds. It's going to take some of the most engaged people for us to pull this off. But I think that I do feel it can be done we just have to engage people from that perspective. So one of the things that we're doing in terms of the Black Panther Party is we're doing going back to war again. Um, we're implementing the draft. So whenever possible, I will come we come across people that we know are capable of carrying that banner and moving forward with that, and we team up with them because we have to. When we see people, no different than what the system does, when they see the brightest and best, they go after them. They go after them and incorporate them into their corporations so that those corporations can thrive and that they can have their future projections and budgets can constantly elevate and elevate and elevate. Well, we have to have the same mentality. We have to go out after the bright minds and the brilliance and the people that have that accelerant to be able to go forward. And the problem that I think we find ourselves facing is that when people tend to feel like they the stuff, they let their ego stop them from trying to recruit somebody that's potentially better than them. So they want to always feel like they're the one out front. And I think that's one of our biggest hangups. And I think that just kind of goes back to what I referred to earlier in terms of epigenetics and dealing with the Willie Lynch syndrome, to where uh, folks want to feel like they the best thing that ever cooked that has been cooked up. And so the last thing they want to do is recruit someone else that can replace them. And I think that's part of the strategy that was worked against us as a people in the first place. And so if we're gaining our freedom, we have to move beyond these personal dysfunctionalities that hold us back.
Uh, my final question for you, at least for this evening, uh, when we have organizations that have a long history, such as the Panthers, and now we have these new faces, Black Lives Matter, like I was saying before, some of the old institutions, the NAACP, things like this. But it seems to me like people are more ready for action and for leadership, for an active leadership, not just for figureheads. Why isn't the Black Panther Party more visible nationwide?
I would say the reason why the Panther Party is not more visible nationwide has to do with the fact that, for one, social media is not dominated or controlled, for one, by us. Number two, again, being at war, part of what we face is a situation to where even when you talk about the ranks of the Black Panther Party, for instance, um, well, last week we just came off of the celebration, so to speak, of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Black Wall Street, and mind you, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, last weekend you had a contingent of Black Panthers marching through the city armed. Okay, now that made it all over the news. And one thing I want to say in regards to that, not that I agree with that tactic, but one thing I want to say in regards to that is that what you had is a opportunity to where the presence of the Panther was presented to give people recognition that, hey, we are out there. Are you ready to step forward and be a part of something bigger than yourself? Are you ready to be a part of something that's going to seek self determination and pull our people closer to being able to work the elements that we need to do in order to empower ourselves? Um, so I just think that when you have situations like organizations like the Black Panther Party, where we're still and constantly dealing with elements of suppression, elements that are looking to try to destroy and not allow us to get the visibility that we need. And so, built within our structure is just the fact that these kind of things go along with being on the battlefield at the level in which we are. So we find that within the ranks of the Black Panther Party, we have to operate more like special forces than we do the general infantry. And so, from
Okay.
that standpoint, you don't see special forces the same at the same level that you will see they did general infantry. And so therefore the special forces obviously have to be more trained. They obviously have to be more rigid, and they obviously have to be more committed in their cause. But at the same time, that also means that the visibility and as well as the amount of I would say field operation or field time that we get is not going to be to the same level of that of the general involvement, because more training is involved, and more preparation is involved. So hopefully that answered your question.
When you related to special forces, of course, I can relate. So, yeah, it's kind of like that hidden spear, as we used to call it. Uh, you know, so yes, I do definitely relate to that. But why don't you give us your final thoughts for the evening? And next week we're going to be talking about critical race theory versus culturally responsive teaching. So I'm looking forward to your views on that also. But why don't you give us your final thoughts for the evening, and let us know any events or anything that you might want us to know about the San Diego party of the Black Panthers.
Well, basically, my final thoughts are for those that are constantly listening to this program: continue to empower yourselves, continue to do your own research, your own study. Do not allow yourself to just take hold of any opinion, even mine, uh, for just what is was stated, but actually get out and be a part of it. I'm always pushing the fact that we need more people involved in this movement, not just within the Panther Party, but just in general, facing, ready to stand and face oppression, ready to stand and try to tackle the constructs of what oppression is bringing, and not just for the sake of saying black people, but for the sake of humanity. Because we have to recognize that as a collective body of the human race, we are on a path of self-destruction. And just like the last person that was on your panel talked about, is Mother Nature will find a way to set things straight. And I don't think that none of us really want to be on that end of the stick. And so the sooner we figure out ways to work together, the better it will serve the entire human race. And if nothing else, approach it from that perspective. And then maybe that will help us to ease some of the levels of defensiveness that comes with the fact that the topic of addressing racism, seems to cause people to not want to have that discussion or not want to think about it at this moment in time, and just blow their rose colored glasses. They just can't hop along. So within the Black Panther Party, in closing, I just like to say, um, it's all about power to the people. It's all about us as a human race doing our part to make things better, which means that we have to address moderation. We have to deal with uh, coming at things from excessiveness in all capacities, and just do our part. The San Diego Black Panther Party is will be out in the community, engaging with the people on Juneteenth, at various places. And we would like, just people to just really think about what Juneteenth means, and I go into maybe find a way to interject that in further on the next discussion that we have next the following Monday. Um, just in regards to that, even going back to one of the earlier questions you asked about, are we playing catch up? The whole idea behind the Juneteenth celebration is Black people celebrating the fact that we were last in finding something out, and now we want to play catch up. So let's use that to draw further perspectives on what we need to be doing to not always be playing catch up, and let's be ahead of the game at some point and work toward those. So with that, I like to say all power to the people.
Well, thank you so much, Brother Williams, and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Yes, sir.
Uh, with that being said, I want to thank everyone for listening. Thank our guest, Mr. Bodine Sanders, also Miss Dahlia Balmier for helping me start the show while we were waiting for our guests. Thank you so much, everyone, and I look forward to talking to you again next Monday. As I said, our subject will be CRT versus culturally responsive teaching. Have a great night. Look forward to talking to you next week.